Hi everyone. Today we're here at the shooting range to test out some ammunition combinations for 12 gauge. With a focus on home defense, meaning those activities aimed at protecting yourself and your loved ones inside your home when faced with an external threat. I should mention that personally I am a bit critical of using a shotgun compared to a handgun because of the length and bulkiness of this type of weapon. If any of you have seen the footage where the fugitive Igor is disarmed by the bartender, who later dies from wounds inflicted by the second weapon, the backup weapon that Russian criminal had, you'll have seen how the bartender, with a burst of instinct for survival, manages to get the upper hand. On Igor even pulling the rifle out of his hands, since being long, in tight and cramped spaces like those of a house, it's harder to wield and offers more places to grab onto. And so, what could be a weapon for protection can actually turn into a weapon of offense, one you might even have to defend yourself from. By now we know very well that the quantity and variety of loads you can use in a shotgun is practically endless. And each load has its own characteristics, both at the moment of firing and on the target, so also from the perspective of terminal ballistics. Here in front of me we can see just a few of the available loads, which can be used in a 12 gauge, and we'll start with the least suitable and move towards the most appropriate ones to use inside a home. This cartridge here, which you might think is a poorly homemade round, is actually a factory-made round equipped with two perfectly spherical lead balls, and it boasts this feature. Terrible stock crimp, really ugly to look at. This is the so-called Maremma ball. The Maremma ball, that is, the two stacked balls, has an extremely high stopping power because terminal ballistics physics teaches us that two bodies impacting at close range in quick succession on the same target, they have a terminal and final effect on the same target that is greater than what a single body, whose mass equals the sum of the two, would have. So why exactly did I list this as the most fundamentally wrong shot? Well, first of all, we are talking about a very high level of stopping power, but there is also a high risk of dangerous ricochets and the potential for excessive penetration. The exact same considerations apply to loading with a bear ball, that is, a typical load for wild boar hunting, using a lead ball with a diameter equivalent to that of the cylinder bore. That's already a bit better. When we talk about undersized balls, we're still talking about bear balls, so just a single projectile, a single shot. However, in the case of undersized balls, it generally refers to a slug of a smaller caliber, enclosed within a wad. Here too the problem is penetration, excessive penetration, and an excessive tendency to ricochet. The advantage is that we reduce the weight. By reducing the weight, we also reduce the stress, the recoil, the power, and the ammunition load, so in a way, we give ourselves a bit of help. When we look at it from this specific perspective, perhaps dry-loaded sporting rounds are actually much more beneficial and advantageous. But what exactly does the term sporting imply in this context? These are slugs that basically have a lower lead charge, so a lighter projectile, and a lower propellant charge because they are essentially designed to punch holes in paper targets, not to inflict lethal damage on ungulates. Ungulates are generally wild boars and deer, wild boars in our area. They are much tougher than humans, even though humans are often quite boar-like themselves, and so they require greater stopping power, especially because they are engaged during hunting drives at longer distances. Alright, let's get ready to shoot. Obviously, at this stage we're not dealing with what is the psychological factor of self-defense, the stress that one can experience, and the difficulties this stress can cause at the moment of defensive action. with a firearm, but it's a complex topic that requires very long, careful, and ongoing training to avoid making the mistakes that make defensive activity a danger. First of all, for ourselves and for our loved ones, we will start by using slug loads to see their effect at our distances. We will begin with the Maremana slug, the double ball, and then we will use the slug. To begin, we have the hunting slugs, then the undersized slug, which is also meant for hunting, followed by the 20 gauge lead shot that includes a wad, and finally, we have a 28-gram target slug for each and every shot. We will load one round into the tubular magazine to check that the explosion of the first shot is able to properly feed the second round in a semi-automatic. Because, as we will see later with the salt rounds and rubber pellets, the semi-automatic won't be able to do this. As you can see, our target is about 5 or 6 meters away, so we're getting ready to do our first test by firing with the slug. Maremana. Now let's take a moment to check that the second round has been chambered correctly into the firearm, and as we can see, it certainly has. With the chamber now empty and safe, let's go ahead and walk down to check the target to see exactly what we've done with our shots. As you can clearly observe from this perspective, the shot was undoubtedly lethal in its impact. Numerous jagged pieces of wadding have forcefully pierced through the target material, yet despite that extensive damage, the distinct entry points created by the two heavy slugs remain remarkably and clearly visible to the naked eye for further analysis. The slug. As always, safety on. Let's load the second round to check that it arms properly, and we're ready to fire. Let's check. The second shot was armed correctly. Let's put the weapon back on safe and go see what happened to our target. Here we have an excellent shot, considering that my sighting system is zeroed at 25 meters. Here, being at 6 meters that it's a bit lower is absolutely normal. Let's patch up this hole as well and move on. Now it's time for the subcaliber round. As always, we carefully load our ammunition round to check the feeding, disengage the manual safety mechanism, and steadily aim directly at the designated target. That looks perfect. The safety is now engaged. The feeding mechanism has been checked, and the feeding is indeed correct. Let's see exactly what happens on the specified target. Here we have the holes from the wad, because the subcaliber round is equipped with a wad, so it looks like two slugs, but they are not two slugs. It's the slug and the wad traveling very, very close together. The last slug load is the low lead weight sporting type load. As usual, let's load the projectile to see if it feeds the next round safely. That looks perfect. Let's take a look. Feeding is absolutely correct. Let's put the safety back on here as well. We have a very reassuring result compared to the previous loads. The recoil is also more contained, as are the velocity and the weight of the slug, so there is less penetration and certainly a devastating effect. In the same way, let's move on to consider other types of loads, particularly buckshot ammunition, the so-called pellets. Here we have an extremely powerful load. 15 buckshot pellets, bookshot 11.0. So almost 9 millimeters in diameter each for a load that exceeds half a hectogram of lead. Here, we're around 57 grams. This is probably the ultimate ammunition for tactical use, because as you can see, it doesn't have a wad. The pellets are only contained by the shell casing. It tends to spread very quickly, So at 10 meters it already starts to widen the shot pattern considerably. These are not ideal rounds for use inside the home because, unlike other loads, they are able to disperse. But the tendency to ricochet of these projectiles makes them too dangerous. There's a risk of injuring yourself, of self-inflicted wounds, or of hurting people, or damaging things you don't want to harm. And they still have a very high penetrating power, so there's a risk of passing through partition walls. The situation starts to improve when we talk about classic Terzerol, that is the 9 pellets, still in 11.0. This time, as you can see, they're darker, because while the others are nickel-plated, these are made of soft lead and have the advantage of bouncing slightly less. Because soft lead, it's called soft precisely because it tends to deform very easily, is still an excessive load since the spread inside a house at distances not exceeding 3 meters is negligible. And the momentum contained in such heavy pellets is so great that ricochet or penetration through walls cannot be ruled out. Now let's try the two loads with buckshot ammunition. More powerful, that is, the large buckshot, both the more disruptive version, the one with 15 nickel-plated pellets, 11.0, 57 grams of lead. And let's also recall the more classic load with 9 buckshot pellets, 11.0 in soft lead, weighing 34 grams. Let's chamber it. Safety off. And now let's take a closer look at the overall extent of the projectile spread and the resulting damage inflicted on the target. So now let's start looking at some more interesting loads, like the classic coarse salt load, the one our grandparents used to keep fruit thieves away from the orchards. This load can only be used in pump-action shotguns because the amount and weight of the salt do not allow a semi-automatic shotgun to cycle, so we can use it either in pump-actions or in double-barreled shotguns in the appropriate holders. And I can assure you it hurts. It's a good deterrent. So why do I advise against using it? Because if the attacker is dressed heavily in winter, you might only make him angry and not actually cause him any harm. It is very likely that you might not be able to stop the criminal and offensive actions he is taking against you, and these behaviors could even be significantly intensified by the anger and fear he is feeling. A similar argument applies to rubber pellets, the so-called less than lethal rounds, which are designed for riot control and police use. They're perfectly suitable for that specific use. Inside a house, however, they bounce around like pinballs, so even if they all hit the criminal, you could very well end up getting hit yourself, and if one hits your eye, they'll have to remove it from your skull, so they can absolutely put you out of action. You should definitely avoid using them because they are completely useless, even when considering them from a strictly legal perspective, because at close range, a rubber pellet load can be absolutely deadly. And it won't even take a year off your prison sentence if you use a firearm outside the strict boundaries of self-defense. Legitimate. Now, before we continue, let's replace our target We are starting with one target placed at a shooting distance that is perfectly compatible with a realistic home defense situation. So for this drill, we'll stay within 5 to 6 meters, which is more or less the maximum distance you might have in a hallway or a very large living room. Now we'll fire one shot with rubber buckshot and one with salt. In this case, most likely, we won't have a reload in either situation. Safety off. As you can clearly see right here, there was absolutely no reload animation at all. Here as well. the cartridge was not ejected properly. This is a problem you don't get with pump-action shotguns. On the target. Looking closely at the target, you can clearly see the significantly larger holes left behind from the rubber ammunition, and right next to them, you can observe the dense cloud of tiny holes caused by the impact of the coarse salt grains. As we mentioned here, we can appreciate a really minimal recoil, a very low noise, so a low level of stress when using the weapon. The effect, unfortunately, it does not guarantee the safety of the result. Let's start moving on to the loads that are more suitable, This is quite advantageous for us, Kanikian. So if we truly want to go ahead and shoot with a single slug cartridge, we have already mentioned that the absolute best option is the calibrated one. It is even better if we decide to do it with a mini shell at reduced load, therefore, with specially made ammunition that has less powder, produces less muzzle flash when fired, gives less recoil, and makes less noise. Because when shooting inside a home, where we will probably and intentionally be without hearing protection, we risk going into shock. We ourselves, the shooters, after the first shot goes off, and not being able to fire a follow-up shot to check if we have hit the threat, to check if our action was therefore adequate, not before a certain number of seconds, which in a plausible firefight is too long. A firefight generally lasts 2 to 3 seconds. I feel compelled to advise against this solution as well. So we have a load that is always reduced. This time with buckshot, not 11-aught but 10-aught. In the fourth row, instead of 3, there are 4. And with a reduced amount of lead, something we can do by loading our own cartridges. Here we have 2 rows of 10/0 lead pellets. Better, but even much better, if we use cartridges with small pellets. Cartridges with small pellets. This is a mini shell, but also the ones generally used in sport shooting. For clay pigeon shooting inside a home at a shooting distance of 2 to 3 meters. Useful, they behave on impact with the target just like a single slug. At those distances, a cartridge filled with pellets delivers the entire load, the whole volume, the cloud of pellets concentrated as if it were a solid slug. And its only limitation is a lower penetrating power, which for us is an advantage. It doesn't go through to the other side of the wall. And it has very poor ricochet potential because the pellets are small, they get squashed and tend to fall where they are. Even those that might ricochet have such a small mass that if they hit us, it would be no different than dust. Let's finally get to what we want to know. Better. A clay pigeon shooting cartridge, a 7.5, but a 7, an 8, or a 6 work just as well. Easy to find, 24 grams, so very little recoil. Let's put the safety on, chamber it and load it. The dummy rounds to check if it feeds. I'm aiming at the head, let's see what happens. As you can clearly see at this specific distance, most of the individual pellets tend to stay tightly together. It behaves more or less exactly like a single, very light slug. Consequently, it is very similar in performance to a standard target slug, just as we have discussed in detail so far. It will be the most efficient, most effective body with the least shooting stress, but in addition, it will have a tendency to ricochet and almost no penetration, which is great. Now we'll use a pump-action shotgun. In this case, we have a beautiful Remington Model 870 to fire the specific rounds that cause those persistent cycling issues in the semi-automatic shotgun. For our final round, we are going to load a standard birdshot cartridge, specifically the variety commonly used for competitive trap shooting, which has consistently provided us with the best ballistic results so far. Consequently, proceeding in reverse, we will load them in that exact sequence. First, we have some of these mini shells loaded with double-aught buckshot, which, as we have observed in previous tests, often tend to jam up the action. Next, we have another mini shell variant containing a single solid slug, followed by a mini shell packed with rubber buckshot for less lethal use. And finally, we have a specialized riot control cartridge that is filled with 9 individual rubber double-aught type buckshot pellets, which is basically a third distinct type of round. Riot control. Obviously, we'll load this one into the chamber. Safety off. Perfect. We were able to confirm that, in fact, with the pump-action shotgun, we don't have any operational issues. This is one of the reasons why so many people prefer this option for home defense. However, I feel the need to make a few clarifications now. While it's true that this type of shotgun allows you to fire any kind of cartridge, it is also true that in a situation of psychological stress, when you are defending yourself, operating the pump-action loading system can become, together with the tension, the thought of shooting at a human target, and the fear of harming yourself or your loved ones, an activity that may present some drawbacks. In other words, this means that you might find yourself unable to properly cycle the pump action of the firearm, leading you to repeatedly reach for the trigger, only to find that there is absolutely no result. Having said that, it is important to note that reduced charge ammunition will obviously still fire from the weapon as intended. It delivers a smaller amount of lead at a lower muzzle velocity. As a result, its power is of course lower. Even in this case, I would still prefer to use shot shells with pellets. At that point, the advantage of the pump-action shotgun is lost. We're left only with the disadvantage of having to manually operate the action. Now let's go ahead and have a little bit of fun. Switching the safety off now. Although, as we have already stated at the beginning of this video, we do not intend to provide any legal considerations or advice on how to interpret laws regarding self-defense, I would like to make a very brief remark as we wrap up. We have seen the various effects of different cartridges and the various loads used. You have surely been able to appreciate the incredible potential of buckshot loads. Italian law, when the conditions for legitimate self-defense are met, when it is established that the act of defending oneself is legitimate, does not place any limitation on how this right may be exercised. You can defend yourself with anything, even a kitchen knife, with a chair, with a stick, with the rifle or pistol you have for sport shooting, and therefore also with the ammunition you have at home, even if it's for sporting use. So if I use hollow points for shooting at the range, I will be able to use hollow points, which is not allowed, is not permitted for those who have a defensive carry permit, who are required to use cartridges specifically for defense, which in the case of handguns are full metal jacket cartridges. That said, let's clarify one thing. Buckshot loads do not have any particular sporting value, so they are used for training purposes in sports, but competitions are not held using buckshot. Instead, pellets are used, as in clay pigeon shooting, and also in some dynamic shooting disciplines or dry bullets for target shooting. Therefore, a prosecutor who wants to be a bit strict in a criminal trial could raise objections if you use this type of load, given that you have purchased and possess this type of shot ammunition exclusively for defensive use. So, the use of the weapon would be, in a certain sense, premeditated in this scenario, with a type of load that is absolutely prohibited for those who have a firearms license for self-defense, which, let's remember, also exists for long guns and specifically allows only the use of standard bullets. With that said, let's close this parenthesis. Very well, as we have been able to directly verify, I hope that the considerations we expressed theoretically have found visual confirmation and support for what we have been claiming. Both Andrea and I remind you that mini shells are reduced charge cartridges. They are excellent, but it is preferable to use them with a manually operated shotgun rather than a semi-automatic one, the well-known pump action side by side or over and under, because, as expected, they have cycling issues in semi-automatic shotguns. Semi-automatics? Which one gave us the most satisfaction? Definitely the lighter loads, the target slugs, and the buckshot loads, which, as we saw on the target, deliver results in terms of shot concentration, and therefore for what interests us in the case of home defense, stopping power. Extremely similar to that of a solid slug, with the added undeniable advantage of low penetration power and very little ricochet.